Everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to kind of go over and cover the balance framework article that Riot published last week towards the end of the week, but they did recently say that they're going to be basically live tweeting, kind of live covering their work on this incoming patch and kind of dictating, showing us the new framework in action. So really exciting to see how that kind of is going to play out. So did want to kind of go over what they were talking about, what this new approach is supposed to be, and kind of give my thoughts on how this is all going to shape out. Now, if you haven't seen the article, I will run through it here really briefly for you and kind of explain exactly what it is, because I know that there are a lot of acronyms and abbreviations and numbers that a lot of people might be confused by. Now, first and foremost, Riot have published their exact criteria that will be used to determine if a champion needs buffs or nerfs. So no longer is this going to be, well, this champion is overpowered because we say so. They will be able to actually point at numbers and say this is exactly why. And if the champion falls into these categories, they will get balanced. So that's obviously really exciting, because that way we'll know, hey, that champion does need to get changed, that champion doesn't need to get changed, all sorts of things like that. So first and foremost, Riot have divided the community into 4 groups. The first of which is average play, which is the bottom 90% of players, which is generally up through gold, actually. So these are, in these categories, Riot are primarily looking at a champion's win rate, and this will be adjusted if their ban rate is above the global average. So right now, the global average ban rate is about 7%. Most champions are banned around 7% of the time. If a champion starts exceeding this by a higher amount of value, then their win rate will be a little more tightly banded. Riot won't wait for them to start gaining significantly more win rate. Well, they'll start looking at them if their win rate even starts approaching the sort of top end of things. However, generally, they will be looking at win rate primarily to determine if a champion is too strong, and that's what they're going to be doing to try and balance for most everybody who plays the game. The next group is skilled play, which is the top 10% of solo queue that disregards the very, very top of solo queue. This has the same criteria as average play, but it's slightly more restrictive because these players are generally have a tighter variance and are more closely affected by champions being overpowered. So it's not that much different from average play. So for the most part, a champion is going to be balanced based off of their win rate, and that will be adjusted based on their ban rate. So if a champion isn't winning necessarily as much as other champions, but are getting banned a lot, then they will get changed. Moving on to elite play, which is the top 0.1% of solo queue players. So this is basically just like challenger players, maybe grandmaster and master players as well, but generally that's what you're going to be looking at. Elite play is going to be based on ban rate. So generally, if a champion is getting banned quite often in elite play, it means that they're probably too strong, because elite players are a lot better at finding out what's broken and then exploiting that, or banning that out because they don't want to play against it. So if a champion is getting banned a lot in elite play, it's probably too strong, and that's why Riot are going to be looking at that for champions that are too strong. The bottom end, however, is going to be based on presence, which is how often a champion appears in pick or ban. So a champion with a very low presence, so below 5% presence. So if a champion is being picked or banned less than 5% of the time, that means they're too weak for elite play and may need to be looked at for buffs. Finally, moving on to professional play, which is the last group. That is the top 5 recognized professional leagues, which means the LCS, the LEC, the LPL, the LCK, and the LMS. Those are the biggest leagues. They're based on presence at both ends. If a champion has a 90% presence, so they're being picked or banned 90% of the time, they are too strong. A 5% presence is too weak. So if a champion ever hits that, then that means they may be slated for buffs for professional play. Now, this gives you sort of the bounds at what Riot is looking for based on too weak or too strong. However, that doesn't dictate whether or not a champion actually receives balance changes. Instead, Riot have a different method of selecting that. If a champion is too strong for any of these leagues, it will be nerfed. So that means if a champion is balanced for everything but has a 90% presence in professional play, it will get nerfed. Similarly, if a champion is balanced in everything down to average play, but the champion has a very, very high win rate in average play, then it will be nerfed regardless of whether or not it's a very strong pick professionally. Meanwhile, if a champion is too weak for all of these leagues, it will get buffed. That means that a champion has to have a very low win rate in average play and skilled play, and needs to have a very low presence in elite play and a low presence in professional play before it will be considered for buffs. So it's very hard now for champions to actually receive buffs. They need to be very, very on the weak side end of things, and they have to be, but they don't have to be necessarily that strong. They just have to be unbalanced in one of these groups in order for them to receive nerfs. Finally, if a champion is balanced for any of these audiences, it will be considered balanced. So what that means is that if a champion happens to fit perfectly into average play, skilled play, it's perfectly balanced in those groups, it gets considered to be balanced. And now all of this is just taking Summoner's Rift into account. I know that there are a lot of people who really want to see changes made for Twisted Treeline, myself included, but this approach is not going to be looking at that. Maybe Riot will have time to spin up another team to look at that at some point, but this is all for Summoner's Rift. So this approach will also be favoring a champion-centric approach. What this means is that systemic adjustments will be viewed through a champion lens. So for a good example, the Scuttle Crab changes that were made recently to adjust its spawn time to later in the game was made specifically to try and allow more champions to be played, because the very, very early game approach really did hurt champions that wanted to be taking some time to scale up, that couldn't contest the early Scuttle Crab. That's why that change was being made. Changes made to runes or items will be made with the express intent of allowing more champions to be played, rather than just saying, well, this item is too good, because champions are primarily the lens by which players view the game. Most players are here for the champions, not for the items, runes, systems, that sort of a thing. So that kind of does make sense. Now, with all of that out of the way, now that we've finally kind of described exactly how this system works, if you want to see a few more details, I will have it linked down in the description below. But now that we have all of that out of the way, I did want to talk a little bit about it. I think that these changes in this approach does have a number of benefits. I think that having concrete numbers determine changes is a very good idea that really will help address player frustration. There won't be the case of, wow, Lee Sin is getting buffs. He's way too strong, right? What the hell are you thinking? Why is he getting buffed? It will be a lot more easy for Riot to point to numbers and say, hey, look, he is too weak in literally every single one of these categories based on the criteria that we have selected. Therefore, he gets buffs. Or, for example, why are you nerfing Fiddlesticks? He's not that strong. Well, sure, he's not strong in maybe everything except elite play, but he's too strong there. And that means that he has to be slated for nerfs. So I do think that this is an interesting approach, because it means that Riot have numbers they can point to. And agree or disagree with where those numbers lie, at the very least, they do have a reason behind it, and they have published the exact explanation for what they're doing. This won't just be a willy-nilly approach. Riot will be able to say, hey, you don't have to like it, but this is what we've chosen to go with. I do hope this helps address balance outliers in a more timely manner, and I think it will, because Riot have these numbers. They'll be able to look at it and just say, hey, look, this champion is too overpowered. We can immediately start looking at it, rather than sort of evaluating and saying, well, they're good in casual play, but they're not that good in professional play. Do they really need nerfs? And this sort of back and forth. They can actually say, hey, they're too strong. They've broken our upper bound, and that means that they have to get nerfed. Even if they're too good or not good enough in professional play, it doesn't matter. They're too good in casual play, so we have to go ahead and look at that. So that will hopefully mean that balance changes go through much faster, as opposed to having long periods of time where a champion is too strong. And finally, I think the champion-centric approach will hopefully prevent champions from getting Sejuani. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by that, Sejuani was very, very strong back in the day, right after her rework, I actually believe. And then, so Riot ended up nerfing Sejuani and primarily she was too strong because of her interactions with Cinderhulk and how good she was with Cinderhulk. So they nerfed Sejuani in order to balance her with Cinderhulk, and then they nerfed Cinderhulk. So the champion essentially got doubly nerfed and just really entered an almost unplayable state for a long period of time, because she got nerfed herself and then her item was nerfed. Because this approach more or less balances for champions specifically and less about, you know, trying to balance around items and that sort of a thing, it does mean that you have the sort of advantage of being able to say, well, the champion is going to be the one looked at for buffs or nerfs. They're not going to be looking at items quite as often, and hopefully this means that champions getting Sejuani'd, which feels absolutely terrible, by the way, won't happen quite as much, if at all. However, I do think that this approach, with all of its advantages, does have some disadvantages. I don't think it's completely good. I think the problem is if champions don't fall into any of these categories, but they still need work, they might not end up getting it, even if players are dissatisfied, because Riot are saying, well, that numerically they're fine, but players are still frustrated by them. Riven, I think, is a good example of one recently that players were really dissatisfied with. if a champion has low counterplay or if they have high frustration, but they still are balanced for all these groups, well, then they're just not going to get changes, and everyone's going to be saying, wow, I'm kind of disappointed with that. That's not exactly what I wanted to see happen. I was hoping this champion would get changed more frequently. It may also not address champions that are unsatisfying to play, but technically balanced. Old Aatrox, I think, is a good example of this, how technically a balanced champion, totally fine, but unfortunately, he is just unsatisfying to play. But he wouldn't be looked at for work by Riot at all, because technically, according to our numbers, again, he's balanced. So sort of on the opposite side of things, rather than being too strong or too weak, sort of being, just generally dissatisfying. The other thing is, it may still cause an unfortunate warping of champions who rely on or abuse certain items. So if this class of champions, Juggernauts for example, are really good with Black Cleaver, it might mean that eventually they get nerfed to compensate for the fact that all of them are building Black Cleaver as opposed to the item being nerfed, and that, by extension, means that all of these champions are now dependent on Cleaver in order to function. They have to build that item in order to do anything, because otherwise they're too strong. Generally, and so it does mean that Sejuaniing is still a thing that can happen. I don't know that it will entirely disappear, because I can certainly see Riot saying, well, we're going to nerf Sejuani because she's too good with Cinderhulk, and then we're going to nerf Gragas because he's too good with Cinderhulk, and you know what, let's just nerf Cinderhulk because tanks are too good with it. Well, those champions then need to get compensation buffs, and it ends up being a problem. So I don't necessarily think that this approach is going to be the be-all, end-all, but I do have high hopes for it. I think it has a reasonable chance of being successful. At the very least, I think it has a good chance of addressing player concerns and helping them feel like my champion is getting nerfed because of this criteria that Riot have put out. I hope that's the case. I really do hope this works out. We'll see how it goes. Riot will be sort of live streaming, so to speak, the changes and how they're actually going to play out over the next patch or so. So we'll have to see at the end of the day how this is going to go. I'm really have high hopes for this, but we'll have to see. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video like this every Monday, Wednesday, and every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. And let me know what you guys are thinking of all this down in the comment section below. I would love to hear your thoughts, if you think this is a approach that's doomed to failure, or if you're optimistic like me about its possibilities. Let me know down in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I will talk to you all later.